The conference room smelled like champagne nobody had drunk yet. I sat at the head of the long glass table, my name printed on a folder I hadn't opened, watching the room arrange itself around my wife like satellites finding their orbit. Min-young sat at the center, in the chair that always seemed built for her, light from the floor-to-ceiling windows catching the edge of her smile. Beside her, close enough that it had stopped registering as strange to anyone but me, sat Tae-yang. 3 investors from the Hyawan Group were seated across from us, their lawyer beside them flipping through the final contract, 999 million, the number that had taken 10 years to become real. Our own legal team sat to my left. Sumin, our CFO, kept glancing at her tablet and then at me, like she was waiting for something she couldn't name. Everyone in that room believed they already knew how the day would end. Before we moved to signatures, the Hyawan lawyer said, adjusting his glasses, we'll need confirmation on the final structural terms, the guarantees, the technical handoff clauses. Mr. Han, if you could walk us through the closing section. That was me. Han Jae-won. 10 years of my life folded into a clause titled closing section, because that was the only place my name still appeared in any of this. I looked at the folder. I looked at Min-young, who had already half-turned toward me with the easy, automatic expectation of someone reaching for a light switch they'd flipped 10,000 times before. Tae-yang was watching me too, but with something else under his composure, a flicker of anticipation, like he was hoping for exactly this moment, a stage where he could step in and finish what I started. I thought about the 10 years. I thought about the 3 a.m. calls I used to take so Min-young could sleep before a pitch. I thought about the supplier crisis in our second year that I solved alone, in a parking garage, while she was on stage accepting an award for visionary leadership. I thought about how many times I had said it's fine, don't worry about it, and meant it, every single time, until I didn't anymore. I stood up. The room didn't react at first, standing wasn't unusual, people stood to present, to point at screens, to shake hands. But I didn't move toward the screen. I buttoned my jacket, the way I always did before leaving a room, and I looked at the lawyer, then at the investors, and finally, only briefly, at my wife. Then sign without me, I said. For a moment, nobody moved. The air conditioning hummed. Someone's pen clicked, then stopped. Min-young laughed, not loudly, just a small, warm exhale, the kind she gave when a waiter mixed up an order or when I forgot an anniversary date by a day. She reached over and touched my sleeve, lightly, the way you'd calm a child who'd had a long day. Jae-won, she said, low enough that it was almost private, though everyone could hear it. Sit down. We're almost there. She wasn't afraid. That was the thing I would remember most clearly, afterward, when I tried to understand the exact second everything changed. She wasn't afraid, because in 10 years I had never once not come back to the table. I had stormed out of meetings before, gone quiet for days, disappeared into work when I was hurt, and every time, without exception, I had returned, smoothed things over, signed what needed signing, fixed what needed fixing. She had built an entire understanding of our marriage, our company, our future, on the foundation of that single fact: he always comes back. Tae-yang's eyes moved between us, calculating, the way he calculated everything. J1SSI, he said smoothly, maybe we should take 5 minutes. I don't need 5 minutes, I said. My voice was quiet. Calmer than I expected. I've made my decision. I picked up my folder unopened, the contract still sealed inside, and I walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard the particular silence of a room recalibrating, the soft scrape of a chair as someone half rose and then sat back down, unsure what they had just witnessed. Min-young's voice followed me, still steady, still certain. He'll be back before lunch, she told the room, and I heard the small, easy laugh underneath it, the laugh of a woman who had never once been wrong about this. I closed the door behind me, and for the first time in 10 years, I did not turn around. 10 years ago, I owned a small structural engineering consultancy, 11 employees, a client list built slowly and carefully, the kind of business that wasn't glamorous but was mine. I had spent 6 years building it from nothing, learning which contractors lied about timelines and which ones didn't, which banks would actually work with a small firm and which ones just pretended to. Min-young had an idea. That was always how it started with her, an idea, bright and fast, arriving like weather. She wanted to build a platform connecting independent architects and designers with manufacturing partners across Asia, cutting out the layers of middlemen that made small studios unable to compete with large firms. She had the vision, the charisma, the instinct for what people wanted to hear and how to say it, so they leaned forward. What she didn't have was any idea how to actually build it. You understand contracts. You understand suppliers. You understand how things actually get made, she told me one night, sitting on the floor of our old apartment with sketches spread across the carpet. I can sell this. I can get people excited. But I need someone who can make it real. I remember exactly how long I sat there before I answered. Long enough that she started talking again, filling the silence the way she always did, listing reasons, possibilities, numbers that were really just guesses dressed up as numbers. I sold my consultancy within 4 months. Took a loss on it. Buyers don't pay full value for a business whose owner is visibly eager to leave. I used what I had, plus most of our savings, plus a loan I co-signed using my father's old apartment as collateral, something I never told my mother about until 2 years later, when it was already paid off and there was nothing left to argue about. That was the first thing I gave up. It wasn't the last. In the early years, Min Young was the company. She was on every panel, every photo, every article about young founders changing the industry. And she was good at it, genuinely good, not just polished. People believed her because she believed herself, completely, in every room she walked into. I was in the back office, learning supply chain software at midnight, calling factory managers in Shenzhen at 5 a.m. Their time because that was the only window they'd answer, sitting across from bankers who looked at me, not at her, when they had real questions, because they could tell I was the one who actually knew the numbers. There's a photograph from our 3rd year that still hangs in the company's lobby. It's from a magazine feature, the faces behind the platform reshaping design. Min Young is in the center, lit beautifully, laughing at something just off camera. Behind her, slightly out of focus, you can see the back of someone's head, turned toward a laptop. That's me. I'm not named in the caption. I never asked for it to be fixed, and after a while, I stopped noticing it was there at all, which, looking back, might have been the actual problem. The first real crisis came in year 2. Our largest manufacturing partner in Vietnam suddenly defaulted on 3 months of orders. Their factory had been operating on falsified safety certifications, and when an inspector finally caught it, the whole operation shut down overnight. We had 41 clients with orders mid-production. If those orders didn't ship, we wouldn't just lose those clients, we'd lose the credibility that the entire platform was built on. Min Young was on a flight to a conference in Singapore when it happened. I remember making the decision not to call her until she landed. There was nothing she could do from 30,000 feet, and I didn't want her walking into a stage panel with that weight in her stomach. I spent 4 days finding 2 backup manufacturers, one in Indonesia and one we'd never worked with in Malaysia, negotiating rush terms, personally guaranteeing payment timelines using a line of credit I opened under my own name because the company's credit wasn't strong enough yet on its own. I flew to Jakarta on a red-eye, sat in a factory office until 11 at night working out specifications with a translator I'd hired off a recommendation from a friend of a friend. When Min Young landed and I told her it was handled, she hugged me, relieved, grateful, and then asked if I minded that she mentioned the Singapore trip in tomorrow's press follow-up, since a journalist there had asked good questions about crisis resilience in scaling startups. I said of course not. And I meant it. That was the strange part, I always meant it. There were other moments like that. A payroll gap in year 4 that I covered personally for 6 weeks before the next funding round closed, telling no one but our accountant. A co-founder dispute with an early investor, not Min Young, someone else entirely, someone she'd brought on before I joined full-time, that I resolved over 11 months of careful, exhausting diplomacy, ending with the investor leaving quietly, on good terms, telling people afterward that the company had handled it gracefully, as if grace were a quality the company possessed independent of any specific person inside it. My older brother, Jae-sung, came to visit once during that period, one of the few times, because by then I'd stopped making time for family the way I used to. We sat on the balcony of the apartment we could finally afford, and he watched me take 2 work calls in the span of 20 minutes, apologizing both times, and then he said something I brushed off at the time. "You know," he said, not looking at me, just watching the traffic below, "you talk about this company like it's yours. But when I read about it, your name isn't anywhere. Doesn't that bother you?" "It's not about whose name is on it," I told him. "It's about whether it works." "Sure," he said. "But one day it's going to work so well that nobody remembers it needed you to work at all." I laughed it off. I told him he was overthinking it, that Min Young and I were a team, that this was just how teams divided labor, someone faces the world, someone faces the spreadsheets. I believed every word of it. What I didn't say, what I didn't even let myself think clearly, was that somewhere in those years, I had stopped wanting credit not because I didn't need it, but because needing it had started to feel like a weakness I couldn't afford. Every time I quietly fixed something without making it a moment, without making it cost anything socially, I was teaching everyone around me, Min Young most of all, exactly what to expect from me going forward. Reliability without a price tag. Devotion that asked for nothing in return. It felt, at the time, like love. It felt like partnership. It felt like the kind of sacrifice that holds a marriage and a company together at the same time, the invisible architecture beneath a building everyone admires from the street. I didn't know yet that architecture, by definition, is the thing nobody looks at right up until the moment it isn't there anymore. I found out about the Haiwan negotiations changing structure from an email forwarded by accident. It was a Tuesday, 8 months before the signing, and I was reviewing the technical due diligence packet, the document that would later become the backbone of everything Haiwan was buying, though none of us called it that yet. Buried in my inbox was a thread titled Updated Equity Allocation, Pre-Series Discussion, sent to me by Yuna, Min Young's assistant, with a one-line note, "Sorry, wrong CC list, please disregard, we'll resend correct version." I disregarded nothing. I read all 40 messages in the thread. The negotiations with Haiwan had shifted weeks ago, a new equity tranche structure, different vesting terms for senior leadership, a slightly revised valuation model. None of it was alarming on its own. What stopped me was that the thread went back 3 weeks, and my name appeared nowhere in it. Not as a recipient. Not as a mention. Min Young, Suman, our lead counsel, 2 Haiwan representatives, but not me, even though the equity structure directly affected the technical milestone clauses I had personally drafted. I didn't say anything that day. I told myself I'd bring it up naturally, when the moment was right, without making it sound like I was keeping score. That evening, Min Young came home late, already half out of her blazer before she'd finished closing the door, talking before she'd even fully stepped inside. "I meant to tell you, we adjusted the vesting schedule on the senior equity tranche. Suman and I worked through it with Haiwan's team last week. It's a small thing, just timeline stuff." "Last week," I repeated. She was already in the kitchen, pouring water, scrolling through something on her phone with her free hand. "I didn't want to pull you into another meeting. You had the technical audit running all week, I figured you had enough on your plate." "It affects the technical milestone clauses, though. The ones I wrote." "Does it?" She looked up, genuinely trying to remember. "I don't think so. It's mostly just about when people vest, not what triggers the vesting." "I can send you the red line if you want." "Sure," I said. "That'd be good." She smiled, relieved, like a small obstacle had been cleared. "I just didn't want to add to your stack." "You've been buried." I almost said, "I'd rather be in the room than have less on my stack." The sentence formed completely in my mind, I could feel the shape of it, the weight of each word. But underneath it was another thought, faster and more familiar. We're 8 months from the biggest signing of our lives. This is not the moment to make her feel like she can't move without me. So instead I said, "Send me the red line." "I'll take a look tonight." She kissed my cheek on her way to the bedroom, already on a call with Suman about something else entirely, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than I needed to, holding a glass of water I hadn't drunk from. The red line arrived at 11:40 p.m. I read it twice. It wasn't catastrophic, she was right that it was mostly timeline language. But buried in section 4.3 was a clause that tied a portion of the new vesting structure to continued operational leadership presence, defined by a metric that, as written, didn't actually account for the kind of behind-the-scenes technical authority I held. On paper, under this new language, if I stepped back from day-to-day operations even temporarily, even for something as simple as taking real time off, certain allocations could be affected. It was the kind of clause that probably meant nothing to whoever drafted it. It was the kind of clause that meant everything to someone whose entire role had never been formally defined in the first place, because he'd never asked for it to be. I drafted 3 different versions of a message to send to Min Young that night. I deleted all 3. The pattern continued, quietly, over the following weeks. Nothing dramatic, that was what made it strange. A vendor renegotiation finalized without the usual technical sign-off loop I'd built specifically to catch problems before they became expensive. A new hire in the operations team, Director of Platform Integration, a title that, on the org chart Yuna circulated, sat in a box with a dotted line running toward Min Young directly, bypassing the box with my name in it entirely, the box that had always been the actual reporting line for that function. When I asked Suman about it carefully, casually, in the kind of tone you use when you're testing whether something is actually a problem or just your imagination, she looked briefly uncomfortable before answering. Min Young mentioned she wanted Daniel reporting more directly to leadership during the pre-close period, Suman said. I think it's just optics, mostly. For Hyeowon. They like seeing a flatter structure on paper before a deal like this. I'm sure it's temporary. Did she mention it to you, or did the two of you decide it together? Suman hesitated, just slightly, just enough. She mentioned it. I just updated the chart. I nodded like that answered something. It didn't. That same week, I was the one who fielded a call at 6:50 a.m. from our largest logistics partner in Busan, informing us that a customs reclassification was about to delay 40% of our Q3 fulfillment volume unless someone restructured the shipping documentation within 48 hours, a problem that, if it became public, would have looked terrible to Hyeowon during due diligence. I spent the next 2 days on calls with customs brokers, rewriting documentation, calling in a favor from a former client of my old consultancy who happened to know someone at the regional customs office. By Thursday, it was resolved. Nobody outside of myself and 2 junior staff ever knew it had been a problem at all. That evening, at dinner, Min Young mentioned that Hyeowon's lead analyst had complimented her, in a closing meeting, on how remarkably clean our logistics operation looked compared to other companies they'd evaluated. She said it lightly, almost as a joke about how little the analysts actually understood about how messy things really were behind the scenes. They have no idea, she laughed, reaching for the rice. No, I agreed. They really don't. She didn't hear anything underneath it. There was nothing for her to hear, I'd made sure of that, the same way I always had. I looked at her, laughing, unaware, beautiful in the kitchen light, 8 months from the deal of our lives, and I felt something settle in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even hurt, not exactly. It was the first time I had ever wondered, even faintly, whether the woman across the table from me actually knew who she was having dinner with. I didn't bring it up. There would be time, I told myself, after the deal closed. Everything could wait until after the deal closed. I didn't yet understand that after the deal closed was a sentence I would hear, in one form or another, for the rest of the year, and that each time, it would mean something slightly different than it had the time before. Min Young told me about Taeyang the way she told me about most decisions now, after it was already, in every practical sense, decided. We were in the car, on the way back from a dinner with one of the Hyeowon board members, and she brought it up the same way she might mention a restaurant reservation. I've been thinking about bringing in some outside help for the international positioning piece, she said, looking at her phone, not at me. Before the deal closes, Hyeowon's board wants to see that we have credible global partnerships beyond just the platform itself. Someone who already has relationships in Tokyo and Singapore markets, who can sit in the room and make those connections feel real instead of theoretical. Okay, I said. Do we have someone in mind? Taeyang, actually. She said it lightly. Easily. The way you'd say a name that meant nothing, that carried no weight, that hadn't, 11 years ago, belonged to the person she was engaged to before she met me. I kept my eyes on the road. Taeyang Park. He's been doing business development consulting for the last few years, mostly cross-border tech partnerships, Japan and Singapore mainly. He actually reached out to me a few months ago, just to reconnect, and when this positioning question came up with the board, I thought of him. He has exactly the kind of network we need right now. A few months ago, I repeated. She was still looking at her phone. It wasn't anything. Just old colleagues catching up. You know how these things go. I did not, in fact, know how these things went. I had never had an ex-fiancé reach out to catch up and then, a few months later, become a strategic consultant for the company I had spent 10 years building the foundation of. But I understood, in that moment, that the conversation had already happened in some form, probably more than once, and that I was being told about Taeyang not because Min Young wanted my input, but because at some point, soon, I would see him in the office, and she didn't want that to be a surprise. This was, I realized, a courtesy. Not a discussion. A courtesy.
Does Suman know? I asked. She's drafting the consulting agreement now. It's a 6-month engagement initially, project-based.
HR is treating it as an external advisor contract, so it won't even go through the full hiring process. She finally looked up from her phone, and there was something almost pleading in her expression, not guilt, exactly, but the look of someone who wanted a particular reaction and was prepared to be a little hurt if she didn't get it.
J1. It's just business.
He's good at this specific thing, and we need it specifically right now.
That's all it is. I thought about every version of the sentence I could say next. Did it occur to you to ask me first? Do you understand what this looks like? Do you understand what this feels like?
I thought about the 8 months until signing, the Haiwan board members who had just spent the evening complimenting the company's stability, the version of this conversation that ended with me saying something I couldn't take back 4 months before the most important moment of both our careers. If you think it'll help with the board, I said, then it's your call. She exhaled relief, mostly, and reached over to squeeze my hand.
Thank you. I knew you'd understand. You always do. You always do.
I turned the phrase over in my mind for the rest of the drive, the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath it, and found that I didn't like what I found there at all.
Taeyang started the following week.
He arrived for his first meeting 12 minutes early, which I learned later was apparently a habit, a small, deliberate signal of competence, the kind of thing that read as impressive to people meeting him for the first time and slightly performative to anyone who'd known him more than a month. He wore a charcoal suit that fit exactly the way expensive suits are supposed to fit, and when Yuna brought him into the main conference room, he stood up to shake my hand with both of his, the way you greet someone you've decided, in advance, to be gracious toward.
J1SSI, he said, with a smile that had clearly been used successfully many times before. It's good to finally meet you properly.
Min Young talks about you constantly, the engine behind everything, she says.
I've been looking forward to this. Welcome to the team, I said. I meant it to sound neutral. I think it landed that way. Mostly.
I have to say, he continued, settling into the chair directly across from Min Young, not beside her, not down the table, but directly across, the position usually reserved for whoever was leading the discussion. The operational structure here is impressive. I've worked with a lot of companies at this stage, and most of them are held together with string and good intentions.
This is different.
Someone clearly built this to last. That would be J1, Min Young said, smiling at me, and for one brief moment, one single moment, I felt something loosen in my chest, a small return of the warmth I'd been missing for months. Of course, Taeyang said smoothly, nodding at me with what looked like genuine respect.
I figured as much. It was a small thing.
A correct attribution, a moment where I was named, seen, acknowledged, exactly the kind of moment I had spent 10 years insisting I didn't need, and exactly the kind of moment whose absence I had apparently been quietly cataloging the entire time.
But even as it happened, something in the room's geometry had already shifted. Taeyang sat across from Min Young. I sat to the side.
When Suman began walking through the Haiwan positioning materials, she addressed the explanation primarily to Taeyang, because he was new, because that was natural, because someone has to be brought up to speed.
But Taeyang asked the follow-up questions. Taeyang offered the first reframing of the messaging strategy.
Taeyang, 40 minutes into his first meeting, had already become the person in the room whose questions shaped where the conversation went next. I sat there, the person who had written most of what was on those slides, and said almost nothing for the rest of the meeting, not because I had nothing to say, but because every time I started to, Taeyang had already started speaking, smoothly, easily, in the slight overlapping way of someone who was never once in his life worried about whether there was room for him in a conversation. Afterward, in the hallway, Min Young caught my arm, smiling.
See? He's good. This is going to help so much before the board meeting. He's good, I agreed. And I meant that too.
That was, somehow, the worst part. I wasn't wrong about him, and I wasn't wrong about myself, and both of those things being true at the same time left no clean place to stand. I told myself, walking back to my office, that this was exactly the kind of moment Jae-sung had warned me about years ago, and that recognizing it was the same as doing something about it.
It wasn't. But I didn't know that yet, not really.
Not until much later, when there was a great deal less time left to do anything about anything at all. By the third week, Taeyang's calendar had quietly merged with Min Young's. I noticed it the way you notice weather changing, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small signs. He was on the morning sync calls now, the ones that used to be just Min-young, Sumin, and me, working through the day's priorities before anyone else arrived. He was on the closed Hyawan coordination thread, the one with maybe 9 people on it total, the thread where the actual sensitive numbers lived. He was in the room physically, now, not just on calls for the Tuesday strategy sessions, sitting in the chair beside Min-young that had, for 10 years, simply been mine, not because anyone had assigned it to me, but because that was where I sat, and where I sat was where I sat. The first time I walked into the Tuesday session and found him already there, in that chair, I took the seat across from him without comment. Nobody else seemed to register it as a change. I told myself it wasn't one chairs were just chairs. The presentation that broke something open was for Green Arc Capital, one of the smaller funds that had been part of our last raise and would be rolling their stake into the Hyawan structure. It was a relationship maintenance meeting more than anything substantive, the kind of meeting where you reassure people who already trust you that their trust is justified. I had drafted most of the deck 2 weeks earlier. Specifically, I had written the section on platform resilience post-acquisition, a framework I developed describing how our technical infrastructure was designed to remain stable through ownership transitions, built around 3 principles: distributed authentication systems, redundant vendor relationships, and what I called institutional memory continuity, meaning the documented processes that meant the company didn't rely on any single person's undocumented knowledge. I had explained this framework to Min-young in detail, at our kitchen table, 2 Sundays before. I remembered the conversation clearly because she'd asked good questions, real questions, the kind she used to ask in the early years, when she still wanted to understand the architecture and not just present it. In the meeting, Green Arc's representative, a measured, soft-spoken woman named Park Hyren, asked a fairly standard question. How are you thinking about operational continuity through the transition? Founders sometimes underestimate how disruptive a change in ownership structure can be on the technical side. It was, almost word for word, the question I had built that entire section to answer. Min-young opened her mouth. I saw her start to gesture toward the slide, toward me, and then Tae-young leaned forward first, smiling, easy. That's actually something we've thought through quite carefully, he said. The way I think about it is in 3 layers. First, you want distributed authentication, no single point of failure in who can access or authorize what. Second, redundant vendor relationships, so no critical function depends on one external partner. And third, this is the one people often miss, institutional memory continuity. Meaning the actual operational knowledge has to live in documented processes, not in any one person's head. That's the difference between a company that survives a transition and one that quietly falls apart 6 months later. He said it well. He said it, in fact, almost exactly the way I had said it, the same 3-part structure, even the same phrase, quietly falls apart 6 months later, which I distinctly remembered saying to Min-young at our kitchen table, watching her nod slowly as she turned it over. Hyren nodded, impressed. That's a thoughtful framework. Whose idea was the institutional memory piece specifically? That's the part most companies get wrong. There was a pause, not long, maybe a second and a half, but long enough that I felt it land somewhere in my chest with real weight. It's something we developed together as a leadership team, Min-young said, smiling warmly at Tae-young, then at the room. Tae-young's been instrumental in helping us think about how to communicate it externally. He has a real gift for making complex operational ideas land clearly. Together as a leadership team. I sat there, the person who had built the framework from nothing, who had spent actual years implementing the institutional memory continuity the slide described, building the documentation systems, training the staff, designing the redundancies, because I had personally lived through what happens when a company doesn't have them, and I watched my wife credit my idea, in its exact original phrasing, to the man sitting in my chair. I could have said something. There was a version of this moment I could feel its exact shape, the same way I'd felt the shape of the sentence in the car weeks earlier where I said, simply and without heat, actually, that framework was something I put together initially, based on the supplier crisis a few years back, happy to walk through the documentation if useful. It would have taken 8 seconds. It would not have been dramatic. It would have been, by any normal professional standard, a completely unremarkable correction. I didn't say it. Hyren moved on to her next question. Tae-young answered that one too, with the same easy fluency, and Min-young nodded along, occasionally adding a sentence of her own, and Sumin took notes, and the meeting continued exactly as if nothing had happened, because,
to everyone in that room except me, nothing had. Afterward, in the elevator, it was just the three of us, Min-young, Tae-young, and me.
Tae-young was looking at his phone, scrolling, and Min-young leaned against the elevator wall, exhaling the particular exhale of someone who thought a meeting had gone well.
That went really smoothly, she said. Hyrin seemed satisfied. I think Green Ark's going to be fine with the rollover terms. The continuity framework landed well, Tae-young agreed, still looking at his phone.
I think that's going to be one of our strongest talking points with Hyeon's board too, honestly. Worth building out a fuller version of it before the next round.
Definitely, Min-young said.
Maybe you and Jaewon can work on that together. You clearly have good instincts for the framing, and he has all the underlying detail.
He has all the underlying detail.
As if the framework were raw material, and Tae-young's contribution was the finished product, as if what I'd built was the ore, and what he'd said in that meeting was the gold.
Sure, I said. The elevator doors opened. Happy too. I meant the opposite of happy.
I meant something closer to the feeling you get when you put your hand on a surface you expect to be solid and it gives slightly under your weight, not enough to fall, but enough to know, suddenly and completely, that it isn't what you thought it was. That night, I sat at the kitchen table where I'd explained the continuity framework to Min-young 2 Sundays earlier, and I thought about Jae-sung's voice from years ago. One day it's going to work so well that nobody remembers it needed you to work at all. I had thought, at the time, that he meant the company. I understood now that he had meant something larger than the company, something that included the company, and included Min-young, and included, apparently, the version of myself sitting at this table, who had just spent an entire meeting watching his own words walk across a room wearing someone else's voice, and had said nothing, because saying something would have been making it about himself, and making it about himself was the one thing, in 10 years, I had never once allowed myself to do. I didn't bring it up with Min-young that night. There would be time, I told myself again, the same sentence, worn smooth now from overuse, like a coin rubbed featureless from being carried too long in the same pocket. But I noticed, lying awake later, that for the first time, I wasn't thinking about when I would bring it up. I was thinking about whether I still wanted to. I found out about the Friday strategy session because of a printer. Our office printer on the 4th floor had a habit of holding documents in queue when it ran low on toner, and that Thursday evening, when I sent a routine vendor report to print before heading home, it released not just my document but 4 others that had been sitting in the queue since the morning, leftover jobs from whoever had used the printer last and walked away before they finished. One of them was a slide deck. 22 pages, titled Post-Acquisition Org Structure Working Draft, with a footer marking it as prepared for a Friday 9 a.m. leadership alignment session, Conference Room B. I hadn't heard about a Friday morning session. I checked my calendar. Nothing. I checked my email, nothing, not even a calendar invite that had been declined or ignored. I stood by the printer for a long moment, the warm pages still in my hand, before I started reading. It was an organizational chart for the company as it would exist after the Hyeon deal closed. Division heads, reporting lines, new titles. Min-young's name sat at the top, as it always had. Below her, a layer of senior leadership, Sumin as CFO, 2 division heads I recognized, and Tae-yang, listed as head of strategic partnerships and integration, with a dotted line running directly to the board. My name was on the chart. It was in a box 3 levels down, under technical operations, reporting not to Min-young, but to a newly created COO position, a position that, as far as I knew, did not currently exist and had never been discussed with me. I read it twice. Then I read the meeting title again. Leadership Alignment Session. A meeting about the future leadership structure of the company I had spent 10 years building, scheduled for the next morning, that I had not been invited to, not excluded with explanation, not informed and asked to reschedule, simply not on the list at all, as if the list had been made by someone working from an org chart that already reflected where I'd be standing afterward. I didn't sleep much that night. I told myself there had to be an explanation, a scheduling error, an oversight, Yuna forgetting to add me to a distribution list. I'd seen smaller mistakes than that happen a dozen times over the years. It was possible. It was even, I told myself on the drive home, likely. But I kept returning to one detail: the document wasn't a draft someone had been casually playing with. It had version control markings, V4, with comments from at least 3 different people embedded in the margins, dated across the previous 2 weeks. This wasn't something thrown together that afternoon. This was a conversation that had been happening, in some form, for at least 14 days, in a room I hadn't been in, about a structure I would be living inside.
The next morning, I went into the office at the normal time. I walked past conference room B at 9:04. Through the glass wall, I could see Min Young at the head of the table, Taeyang to her right, Sumin, the two division heads, and one of the Hyewan board liaisons, a man named Kwan whom I'd met twice. There was a slide on the screen, the org chart, the same one I'd held in my hands the night before, now displayed at full size. I kept walking. I didn't go in. I told myself, even then, that walking in uninvited, holding a printed page I'd technically taken from a shared printer, would look exactly like the thing I had spent 10 years making sure I never looked like. Possessive. Insecure. Difficult. I went to my office and closed the door, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't open my laptop. I just sat there. Min Yoon came to my office around 11, holding 2 coffees, already mid-sentence before she'd fully come through the door. Hey, sorry, that ran long. Listen, I wanted to grab you about something. I saw the org chart, I said. She stopped. Set 1 coffee down on my desk, slower than the sentence required. The post-acquisition structure draft, I continued. Conference room B, this morning. Leadership alignment session. Oh. A short pause, not guilt, exactly, more like recalibration, the look of someone adjusting a plan on the fly. It's still really early stage, J1. Honestly, half of what's on that chart isn't finalized. Kwan's team wanted to see something before the board meeting next month, so we threw together a draft just to have a starting point for the conversation. I wasn't invited. It was a small working session, really just Kwan and whoever happened to be free this morning. It wasn't a real meeting, more of a she searched for the word a working lunch, basically, just moved earlier. I didn't think it needed a formal invite. If I'd known you were free, of course I would have grabbed you. I'm always free for things like that, I said. You know that. I know. She sat down across from me, and for a moment there was something almost like the old version of her, softer, paying attention. I'm sorry. It wasn't intentional. Things have just been moving so fast, and honestly, I figured. She stopped. You figured what? I figured you'd see it eventually and we'd talk it through then. Like, it's not J1, nothing in that chart is set. The CO layer is just a placeholder Kwan's team wanted to see, for governance optics. It doesn't mean anything yet. Doesn't mean anything yet. I looked at her, really looked, the way I hadn't in weeks, maybe months, and underneath the apology, underneath the genuine, I think, discomfort on her face, I saw something else. Not malice. Not even carelessness, exactly. Something closer to efficiency. A version of Min Young that had started, somewhere along the way, to plan the company's future the way you'd plan a renovation while the current resident was still living in the house, drawing up the new layout, deciding which walls would move, assuming the resident would simply relocate to whatever room was assigned to him once the work was done, because that's what reasonable people do when their home is being improved for everyone's benefit, including their own. Okay, I said. Are you upset? No, I said, and the strange thing was, in that moment, it was almost true, not because I wasn't upset, but because the feeling underneath the upset was something quieter and much larger, something that didn't have room for upset yet because it was still arriving. She left a few minutes later, reassured, the coffee on my desk going cold. I found Hyun-woo, one of our earliest engineers, one of the 4 people who'd been there since before the first round of funding, in the break room that afternoon. He was the kind of person who noticed things and said almost nothing about them, which was usually a comfort. That day, it wasn't. You weren't in the morning session, he said. Not a question. No. He nodded slowly, stirring his coffee longer than it needed. Yeah, he said. I noticed that too. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. We both stood there for a moment, in a break room we'd stood in 100 times over the years, and for the first time, I understood that the quiet discomfort I'd been carrying for weeks wasn't just mine. Walking back to my office, I thought about the chart again, my name, 3 levels down, under a COO who didn't exist yet, reporting to a structure that had been drawn without me in the room. And underneath that thought, a colder one arrived, one I hadn't let myself think in those words before. They're not just moving forward without telling me things. They're practicing what it looks like when I'm not here.
I didn't know yet whether that practice was deliberate or accidental, whether anyone involved had even consciously thought of it that way.
But I knew, sitting at my desk that afternoon, that it no longer mattered which one it was. Either way, the future was already being drawn. And in it, I was getting smaller. It started with a folder I wasn't supposed to open. I had been looking for the Daesun Logistics Amendment, the one with the renewal clause affecting 3 sections of the Hyawan technical annexes. Yuna kept physical backups in the gray cabinet near her desk. She had done it that way for 4 years and no one had ever asked her to change it. She wasn't at her desk when I came by. Her coffee was half full and still warm. The cabinet was unlocked. I found the Daesun folder exactly where I expected it, pulled it out, and in doing so nudged a separate folder loose, one sitting tight against the divider, the kind of thing that falls forward and won't go back the way it was. The label on the tab read, Post-Close Strategy, Working Materials, TYP Input. TYP, Taeyang Park. I stood there for a moment, the Daesun folder in one hand, the dislodged folder now half open against the cabinet edge. As I moved to replace it properly, the top sheet slid out and landed face up on Yuna's desk. I could have replaced it without reading it. I didn't. It was a strategy summary, 4 pages, dense, clearly the output of a longer conversation rather than something drafted alone. The header read, Platform Positioning, 18-month Vision, Post-Hyawan. The date stamp in the footer was from 6 weeks ago. I read it in under 3 minutes. The structure was familiar. Some of the frameworks were familiar enough that I recognized their original shapes beneath the new phrasing, the way you recognize a room you lived in once even after someone else has rearranged the furniture. What it described was substantive, genuinely good in places, and built around a set of premises that Min Young and I had never once discussed. The direction it outlined, a pivot toward direct enterprise licensing, a restructured partnership model that de-emphasized the individual designer network the company was originally built on, was not a small adjustment. It was a different company. And someone had spent at least 6 weeks developing the case for it, apparently carefully, apparently in detail, with Taeyang Park. Not with me. I replaced the sheet. I put the folder back. I took the Daesun contract, walked to my office, and did not open it for 47 minutes. I told myself, at first, that I was misreading it, that this was exploratory thinking, the kind someone produces before bringing anything to actual decision makers. That Taeyang had been asked, as external consultant, to generate options, and this was one of them, and it meant nothing about whether Min Young had decided anything. I held that interpretation for approximately 6 hours. Then, late in the afternoon, navigating the shared drive for an unrelated document, I passed through a subfolder I hadn't opened in weeks. Its modification date was 3 days ago. I opened it. 14 documents. Most were familiar. But at the bottom were 3 files created in the last 2 months, all titled variations of the same phrase, Future Framework, Discussion Draft. The most recent was labeled VF3. I opened it. 41 pages. A note at the top read, revised following TYP session April 17th. Input from TYP sessions March 22nd, April 2nd, April 17th incorporated throughout. I did the arithmetic without meaning to. The March 22nd session had happened 2 weeks after Taeyang's first day. The document had been through at least 3 major revisions since then, each incorporating his input. The version I was reading reflected roughly 8 weeks of structured back and forth between my wife and a man who had joined the company 2 months ago. I had not been part of a single session reflected anywhere in it. I could tell, because I recognized the direction it didn't take. The direction I would have pushed for. The one with the operational logic underneath the vision instead of around it. This document thought about the company the way someone thinks about something they're preparing to acquire, not something they built from the inside out. She had not asked me once, in 8 weeks, what I thought about where things should go after the deal closed. In 10 years it had always been true that we would have that conversation when the time was right, at the kitchen table, late, working through it together. There was no version of this document where that had happened. I had not been forgotten in its margins. I had simply not been included in its premise. I found Hyunwoo in the break room the way I always did, not by seeking him out, but by being somewhere and finding him already there, unhurried, with his coffee. The V3 strategy deck, I said. Not a question. He looked at his coffee. I saw it on the shared drive. How long? Longer than V3. There was a V1 I saw on a handout back in March. I thought it was exploratory. He paused. Then V2 in April, in a folder marked for board prep. It wasn't exploratory anymore. March. I thought about what March had looked like: the technical audit, the customs situation in Busan, the vendor renegotiation, calls at 3 in the morning. How full it had been with the work of keeping everything exactly where it needed to be. And how, apparently, while I was doing that, someone else had been sitting at a table I hadn't known existed and drawing up what would replace it. J1SSI. Hyunwoo turned to look at me directly, which he rarely did. The parts of the document that are genuinely good, those are the parts that sound like you. The framing, the risk logic, the way the operational layer is described. Whoever built it used your thinking as a foundation. And then changed the direction. I didn't say anything. I'm not telling you what to do with that, he said. I'm just saying what it is. That evening, Min-yoon came home talking about the Hyeon prep session, already mid-thought about catering for Friday's working lunch and whether the conference room should feel less formal. She was bright, energized, the way she always was in the final stretch before something she'd worked toward for a long time. I sat across from her at the kitchen table. The same table where I'd explained the continuity framework 2 months ago. The same table where years of the company had been built in late conversations, 2 laptops open, whatever problem was most urgent. I looked at her and thought, she doesn't know I found it. And she doesn't know because it didn't occur to her to protect it, because in her version of events, what she'd been doing for 8 weeks was simply working. Thinking ahead. The kind of strategic planning a CEO does before a major transition, with the resources available to her. The resource she had chosen was not me. I had constructed, on the drive home, something close to a question, not an accusation, just a real question, the kind that opens a door. I saw the document. I'd like to understand how you've been thinking about the post-close direction, because I'd like to be part of that conversation. But I sat there and looked at her, and understood that the question was not really a question. It was a door, yes. But on the other side of it was a version of events I wasn't sure I could unknow once I'd heard it. The shape of 8 weeks. The version numbers. The sessions on March 22nd and April 2nd and April 17th, with someone who had been in the building for 2 months. I was not afraid of the answer. I was afraid of something quieter, afraid of her face when she gave it. The specific expression of someone caught not in cruelty but in replacement, who doesn't fully understand yet why that's different, and worse. Busy day? I asked. The best kind, she said, reaching for the water. Productive. Good, I said. I meant the word to land normally. I believe it did. She poured the water, and the evening continued, and I sat at the kitchen table where the company had been built and thought about a conversation that had been happening for months in a room I had not been in, and for the first time, I did not think about how to fix it. I thought about something smaller and more honest than that, whether I still wanted to. I didn't have an answer. But the question, once it arrived, did not leave that I found out the way I had been finding out about most things lately, not because anyone told me, but because the information arrived before anyone had gotten around to deciding whether I should have it. Sumin sent the equity summary to the wrong distribution list. It happened at 7:14 in the morning, before most of the office had arrived, and I imagine she realized it within minutes. The follow-up message, sent 11 minutes later, was a single line: "Apologies, please disregard, resending to correct thread." But I had already read it. I had already read all 6 pages of it, twice, sitting at my desk with my coffee going cold beside me, in the particular quiet of an office that hadn't fully woken up yet. The document was titled, Post-Acquisition Equity Allocation, Final Proposed Structure. It outlined, in clean, well-formatted columns, how ownership in the restructured entity would be distributed after the Hyeon deal closed. Min-young's stake. The founding team's vested positions. Sumin's allocation. The Hyeon rollover. A reserved pool for future senior hires. And one line, near the bottom of page 3, under a subheading labeled Strategic Partners, Converted Positions, Park Tae-young, 2.3% equity stake, vesting over 24 months from deal close date, subject to continued engagement in strategic partnerships and integration role. 2.3%. I set the document down. I picked it up again.
I read the line a third time, in case I had misread the name, misread the number, misread something that would make it mean something different than what it clearly meant.
I hadn't misread anything.
2.3% of a company valued, at current Haiwan terms, at somewhere between 400 and 450 million post-close.
Not a bonus. Not a consulting fee. Not a performance payment for a 6-month engagement. An equity stake.
The kind of thing you give someone when you are telling them, in the only language that has no ambiguity, that they are part of what this becomes, that the future of the thing includes them in it, structurally, legally, permanently. The kind of thing you give someone when you intend for them to still be there in 2 years, and you want that intention written into the architecture of the company so that everyone, including lawyers and board members and future investors, can see it. I thought about the restructured equity pool this stake had been carved from. I knew that pool's history the way I knew most things about this company, not from documents, but from having been present when the decisions were made. Part of it had come from dilution across the founding layer. Which meant, in practical terms, that the 2.3% given to Taeyang had come, in some fraction, from the position I had carried for 10 years, from the share of the future that represented everything I hadn't been paid for in cash because we were always either too early or too close to something bigger to restructure compensation properly, and I had always said it was fine, and always meant it, and had believed, without ever once writing it down, that the future of what we were building was, at
minimum, partly mine. I sat with that for a long time. The office filled up around me. I answered 2 emails that required nothing of me emotionally.
I took a call about a vendor contract that I handled correctly and without effort, because that was the kind of work I could do on the surface of myself even when everything underneath it was doing something else entirely.
At 11, I walked to Sumin's office and closed the door.
She looked up from her screen and immediately looked back down, which told me everything I needed to know about how surprised she was to see me.
The equity summary, I said. I'm sorry about the misdirect, it was a distribution error, I caught it right away, I'm not asking about the misdirect. I sat down across from her. I'm asking about the line on page 3.
She was quiet for a moment. Then, that's been in discussion for about 3 weeks. It came out of the board alignment session. Kwan's team raised it as a retention mechanism for the strategic partner function. The logic was that if Taeyang's role is going to be meaningful post-close, you want him structurally incentivized to stay, not just on a consulting agreement that he can walk away from in 6 months.
Whose idea was the number? Another pause. Min Young proposed it. Kwan endorsed it.
The legal team modeled it.
And where did it come from, structurally? Which pool?
She looked at me steadily. She was good at her job and she was not going to lie to me, which I respected even now, and which made what she said next land exactly as hard as she probably knew it would. Partial dilution across the founding and senior leadership layer.
Everyone contributed proportionally. Including my position. Yes. I nodded. I thanked her. I left.
Min Young found me before I found her. She appeared in my office doorway at 1:30, which told me Sumin had told her about our conversation, which told me Sumin had expected this moment and had decided, correctly, that it wasn't hers to manage. She closed the door behind her. She sat down with the particular composure of someone who has already rehearsed the conversation they're about to have. You saw the summary, she said.
I did. I was going to tell you this week.
We've been waiting for the legal team to finalize the vesting language before making it official, and I didn't want to bring it to you as a half-finished thing. 3 weeks, I said.
She stopped. Sumin said it's been in discussion for 3 weeks. That's not a half-finished thing. That's a decision.
She held my gaze. It's a decision I made because it was the right call for the company's post-close stability.
Taeyang's role in the Haiwan integration is going to be significant, and without equity, there's nothing keeping him here once the consulting engagement ends.
We lose the relationship, we lose the board credibility he brings, we lose, you're giving him a piece of what I built.
I said it quietly.
Not as an accusation, as a fact, stated plainly, because I had decided before she walked in that I was not going to perform calm this time.
I was going to simply be accurate. Not a fee. Not a title. A share. In a structure that exists because of 10 years of work I did mostly without anyone asking me how I was managing it.
Your position isn't diminished by my position, I said, is on page 3 of a document I found out about because someone sent it to the wrong distribution list. The room was quiet for a moment.
J1.
Her voice shifted, not softer exactly, but more careful, the way it got when she was navigating something she hadn't fully planned for.
I understand why this feels like. I don't need you to tell me what this feels like. That landed. I watched it land.
She straightened slightly, the composure resettling. We're 6 weeks from signing, she said. Everything, the board relationship, the Hyawan confidence, the positioning we've spent a year building, it all depends on this period going smoothly. I made a call that I believe protects that. I should have told you sooner, and I'm sorry I didn't.
But I need you to understand that I made it for the company. I know you did, I said. That's exactly what I understand.
She waited for the rest of it, the part where I said I see the logic, the part where I said it's fine, the part that she had come in here expecting, the part that, in 10 years, had always arrived. I let the silence run until she understood it wasn't coming. Are we okay? She asked finally.
Carefully.
I looked at her, this woman I had built everything with, who was looking at me now with genuine uncertainty for the first time in longer than I could remember, because genuine uncertainty required not already knowing how things would go.
Ask me after the signing, I said. She left a few minutes later. I turned back to my desk.
Outside the window, the city went about its afternoon, indifferent, and I sat in the office I had occupied for 10 years and thought about a 2.3% line on page 3 of a document I wasn't supposed to have seen, and understood, with the particular clarity of something you can't unfeel once you've felt it, that the question I had been sitting with since last night, whether I still wanted to, had just gotten a great deal easier to answer. The days after that conversation had a particular quality I hadn't encountered before, not silence, not tension exactly, but something more like the specific stillness of a room after a piece of furniture has been removed.
Everything else in its place. The proportions slightly wrong.
Min Young and I moved through the apartment with the careful, practiced choreography of two people who have decided, without discussing it, to hold something at arm's length until a designated future moment. She was busy, genuinely, usefully busy, the way she always was in the final stretch before something large, and I understood this, and I did not mistake her busyness for avoidance, because I knew the difference. I had watched her work under pressure for 10 years. I knew when she was running towards something and when she was running from it, and most of the time, those things looked almost the same from the outside. She had not mentioned the equity summary again. I had not brought it up. We had both, apparently, chosen to treat that conversation as a closed item, filed, noted, not resolved, but set aside until the signing was behind us. This was a familiar architecture, one we had built together over many years, and I understood its uses. It was the same architecture that had let us survive the Year 2 crisis without breaking, survive the co-founder dispute without fracturing in public, survive every moment that required one of us to absorb something in silence while the other managed the room. What I had not examined, until recently, was what the architecture had cost. I was in the office on a Wednesday, 3 days after my conversation with Sumin, when I walked past the small glass-walled room we used for legal calls, the one with 2 chairs, a phone unit on the table, and a window that faced an interior corridor rather than the street, so that it always felt slightly removed from the rest of the floor. The door was half open. Inside, Sumin sat with her back to me, a document spread in front of her and a phone on speaker, and beside her, not across, beside, shoulder distance, was Taeyang, leaning slightly forward over what appeared to be a structural diagram of the post-close equity table.
On the phone, I recognized the voice of Kwon Byung-hoon, the Hyawan board liaison who handled governance documentation.
He was reading through something.
I didn't stop walking.
I had passed the room before I consciously registered what I was hearing, which meant I had to carry the words backward in my memory to understand them.
Confirm the vesting conditions tie to continued role engagement, not to company performance metrics, correct? And Taeyang's voice, smooth and unhurried, that's right.
The intent is retention, not incentive. The performance upside is already captured in the deal structure itself. What we want is continuity of the strategic relationship, independent of quarter-to-quarter outcomes. And then Sumin, Min Young's position is that this language protects Hyawan's interests in the integration period more than any performance clause would. She went through it with your team last week.
And Kwon, I have her notes from Thursday, yes.
Thursday. I thought about Thursday, about where I had been on Thursday, what I had been doing. I had spent most of the afternoon in a 4-hour call with the Busan logistics team resolving a documentation cascade that had originated from a vendor handoff I'd restructured 3 months earlier. I had told Min Young about the call in passing that morning. She had said, "Good, that one's been sitting there too long." She had not mentioned that she had a call with Kwan's team on Thursday afternoon. She had not mentioned that the vesting language, the specific legal architecture of the 2.3% line on page 3, the line that included a fraction of my position, had been finalized while I was on a different call, keeping the logistics infrastructure intact, so that the deal being discussed in that room would have something real underneath it when the signing day came. I kept walking. The harder thing, and I had been circling it for days without letting myself land on it directly, was not the equity itself. Not in isolation. I had spent enough years in corporate structures to understand that equity decisions in a pre-close period moved fast, were often under-communicated, and almost always looked worse from the outside of the room than from the inside. What I kept returning to was something more particular. When Min Young had come to my office and explained herself, she had said, "I made it for the company." And I believed her. I had believed her completely, which was perhaps the most clarifying thing of all. She had not lied to me, had not maneuvered around the truth or softened it into something palatable. She had told me, with the directness of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to stand behind it, that she had given a 2.3% stake to Taeyang Park because it was right for the company. And I had thought, in the silence that followed, what is the company, exactly, if not 10 years of decisions like the ones I have been making? What is the thing whose stability she is protecting with this equity, if not the infrastructure I built so that her vision had something real to stand on? I was not asking her to name a number. I was not asking to be compensated in equity I hadn't asked for. I was asking something simpler, and it had nothing to do with the document or the vesting schedule or the 2.3%. I was asking whether, in the room where the future was being decided, the person who had built the present was considered part of the conversation. The answer to that question, and I had been answering it slowly, in pieces, for weeks now, was becoming difficult to argue with. Min Young found me in the copy room on Thursday evening, later than most of the staff had left. She was still in her work clothes, carrying a tablet, and she had the slightly softened look of someone who has been moving fast all day and has finally slowed down enough for something human to surface. "Are you going to be late?" she asked. "Another hour or so." She leaned in the doorway. "I thought we could get dinner somewhere that isn't the kitchen." It was, I recognized, a gesture, the kind she made when she had been aware of a thing without addressing it and had decided the gap had gotten wide enough to close. She was good at these gestures. She always had been. In the early years I had loved them, the spontaneous suggestion of dinner, the hand on my arm, the moment of turning toward me that let both of us feel the distance close. I had loved them because they had felt like choosing. She was choosing me, over the next task on the list, over the momentum of the day. That choice had mattered to me in a way I had never fully named. Standing in the copy room, I tried to find that feeling, and discovered that what I found instead was something quieter and more diagnostic. I recognized the gesture. I understood its function. I could not make myself feel it the way I once had, and I was not sure if that was the exhaustion of the past months or something more permanent. "I'll be done by 8, I said. "We could go to the place near Anguk." She smiled, and I smiled back, and it was the correct smile for the moment, and I knew it was the correct smile, and I went back to what I was doing. We went to dinner. It was good, not strained, not performed, genuinely easy in the way that long familiarity can produce even when the layer underneath it is not easy at all. She talked about Hyeon's timeline, about a call she'd had with the board, about a small crisis in the marketing team that had resolved itself. I talked about the logistics documentation, about a technical dependency in the handoff clauses I'd found that weak and quietly fixed. She listened, nodded, said, "I don't know how you keep all of that in your head." I said, "I've had a lot of practice." It was true. It was also, I understood, precisely the problem. We walked back from the restaurant through the neighborhood we'd lived in for 6 years, past the convenience store where I bought coffee on the mornings I left before she woke up, past the small park bench where I had once sat for 40 minutes during a funding crisis in our 3rd year, talking myself down from the particular panic of a company that might not survive the week. We walked in a comfortable silence, and at some point her hand found mine, the way it always had on evening walks, automatic, warm, sure. I held her hand. I thought about the document.
I thought about the vesting table. I thought about March 22nd and April 2nd and April 17th, about the strategy sessions that had been revising the future of the company for 8 weeks without me. I thought about Suman's voice, Min Young proposed it. I thought about the half-open door of the glass-walled room, and Taeyang's voice, and the word Thursday. I thought about what my brother had said, years ago on a balcony, watching traffic. I held her hand and I did not say any of it. There were 4 weeks left until the signing. I had made no decision yet about what I would do, about how far I was willing to let this go before I said the thing I had been not saying for months. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. I told myself I owed it to both of us, and to the company, and to the 10 years, to be sure before I broke something that couldn't be unbroken. But lying awake later that night, listening to Min Young's steady breathing beside me, I understood that I had already broken a small and essential thing, privately, and that the only remaining question was whether anyone else was going to find out and when. I thought about the 2.3%. I thought about what it meant, not the number itself, but the gesture underneath the number. The decision to give someone a stake in the future. To tell a person, in the permanent language of legal documents and board resolutions, that they were part of what this becomes. The person she had said that to was not me. I had built the thing. I had held the thing together across 11 years of crises and reconstructions and early mornings and vendor negotiations and moments no one had ever seen. And the document that described the future of what I had built, the one that would outlast any conversation, that would sit in the legal structure of the company long after all of us had moved on, did not include me in it except as a footnote in someone else's reporting line. I was not angry. That was the strange thing, lying there in the dark. The anger I might have expected, the clean, hot feeling of injustice, had not arrived. What had arrived instead was something colder and more precise, a clarity that kept clarifying, a question that kept narrowing toward a point. After everything, after all of it, is this who she thinks I am? A man who finds out about a decision like this from a misdirected email, and absorbs it, and says ask me after the signing, and still shows up tomorrow morning and does the work? Was it? I lay there and listened to her breathe, and for the first time in 10 years, I was not sure I knew the answer. I stayed late on a Friday, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the reason. Most nights I stayed late because there was something specific to finish, a contract clause that needed another pass, a vendor negotiation that had stalled and needed a quiet hour to think through, a financial model that had shifted and required the changes to propagate correctly through 4 downstream documents before anyone noticed they were inconsistent. There was always something. There had always been something, for 11 years, and on most nights I had stayed and addressed it without registering it as a choice, the same way you don't register the specific decision to breathe. Tonight I stayed because I wanted to look at something, and I didn't want anyone else in the building while I did it. I started with the closing documents, the full stack, not the clean presentation version but the working files, the ones with version histories and comment threads and the accumulated trace of every decision that had been made over the previous 14 months. I had these on my own drive, because I had been the one building them, and because I had a habit, developed over years of watching other people's careful work disappear into company servers and then become inaccessible at inconvenient moments, of keeping local copies of things I had made. I opened the file tree and started reading. Not looking for anything specific, or not, at first. Just reading the way you might read a letter you've written many times, knowing its contents so completely that you're no longer reading the words, you're reading the history underneath them. The technical handoff clauses, mine, written over 3 weeks in the first quarter of the year before, revised twice after conversations with Hyeon's due diligence team, revised again when the equity structure shifted and the milestone triggers needed to be realigned. The redundant vendor agreements that sat behind the platform's fulfillment infrastructure, 11 separate contracts, each with specific carve-out language I had negotiated individually because the standard terms from the platform's original contracts, the ones drafted before I was formally involved, had left a particular kind of liability exposure that nobody else had caught. The informal understandings with 3 of the 4 Hyeon board members that had preceded any formal engagement, not written, not documented anywhere, but real. I had met Kwon for the first time at a trade conference 4 years ago, before Hyeon was even part of the conversation, and had spent 18 months building a professional relationship with him based on the kind of patient, unglamorous consistency that doesn't appear in any company prospectus but is sometimes the actual reason a deal happens at all. I sat there and I read through it. All of it. The whole map. It took about 2 hours. At some point the cleaning crew came through the floor, moving around my office the way they always did, and I barely registered them.
What I was doing had the quality of something that needed to finish itself, and I let it. What I found, by the end, was not dramatic. It wasn't a revelation in the way revelations are usually described. It was more like the experience of standing in a room you've lived in for years and, for the first time, counting the load-bearing walls, understanding not just that they were there, but understanding how specifically the structure depended on them, how precisely each one was positioned, what would happen to the ceiling if any one of them were removed. If I left tomorrow, not quit, not escalate, just stopped answering my phone, the first thing that would break would be invisible to most people in the company. It wouldn't be a crisis anyone could name immediately. It would be a series of small frictions, each individually explicable, building to a pressure that would look, from outside, like operational problems. The Busan logistics partner had a renegotiated rate agreement that renewed automatically unless someone who understood its clause structure flagged the window, a window that opened in 9 days and closed in 19. The authentication architecture for the platform's enterprise tier had a known vulnerability in the edge case failover logic that I had been managing through a manual monitoring process because rebuilding the underlying system would have required a 6-week engineering sprint we couldn't afford during the Haiwan period. I had told no one about this except Hyun-woo, who understood it and was managing one piece of it, and who would handle it if I asked him to but had not been set up to own it independently. Those were 2 things. I kept going. There were 11 more, in the next 40 minutes. Not catastrophic things, not individually. Things that were manageable because I was managing them. Things that had been manageable for years because I had built the systems and maintained them and updated them and handed nothing off because, and here I arrived at the part one had been avoiding, because I had never created the conditions for anyone else to take them over. I sat with that for a while. I had told myself, at various points over the years, different stories about why I worked the way I did. In the early years, the story was partnership, we divide labor by aptitude, she takes the front of the house, I take the back, and together we are more than either of us separately. That story was true, for a long time. Then, later, the story became something more like stewardship, the company was working, and the reason it was working was partly that I maintained things that would break if mishandled, and someone had to do that, and I was the person who knew how. That story was also true. Both stories were true. What I had not told myself, in either version, was the third story underneath them both. I had worked this way quietly, completely, without delegation, without documentation that might make my role legible to someone who could then assume parts of it, because on some level I had understood, and had never examined the understanding, that being the only person who knew how to do certain things was its own form of security. If everything I had built was transparent and transferable, then I was, professionally and perhaps otherwise, replaceable. If I was the only one who knew where the seams were, then I was, at minimum, necessary. Necessity was the thing I had never once questioned. It had seemed, for 11 years, like its own reward. What I understood now, reading the file tree in an empty office at 8:40 on a Friday night, was that I had been half right. I had made myself necessary. What I had not made myself was visible, and those 2 things, which I had long treated as interchangeable, were not the same at all. Necessary meant the building didn't fall down. Visible meant people understood why. I had built the former and neglected the latter so completely that the people running the company, including, apparently, the person I was married to, had arrived at a functional understanding in which my necessity was ambient, environmental, structural in the way that good plumbing is structural, noticed only in its failure, otherwise simply the condition under which everything else operated. I had taught them this. Not through deception, not through any deliberate act of misdirection. Through 10 years of making hard things look easy, of resolving problems before they became visible, of saying it's handled and meaning it so completely and so consistently that the handling became invisible too. My phone showed one unread message from Hyun-woo, sent an hour earlier, "You still in the building? Lights on in your office." I replied, "Yeah. Heading out soon." 3 minutes later he appeared in my doorway, carrying 2 cans of vending machine coffee, the kind we had both been complaining about for years and continued to buy because the alternative was the elevator to the 3rd floor and neither of us ever wanted to do that at the end of a long day. He set one on my desk without asking. He looked at the files open on my screen, not reading them, just registering the volume of what was open, and then he looked at me, with the particular look of someone who has known you long enough to have stopped pretending not to see certain things. "You're doing the map," he said. It wasn't a question. I looked at him. "What map?"
The one where you figure out what breaks if you stop holding it. He sat down across from me, opened his coffee, and didn't say anything else for a moment. I did it once. About 2 years after I started here. I made a list. Took about 3 hours. What did you do with it? He shrugged. Nothing. That's the thing about that list, once you've made it, you understand the question isn't can I hold all of this? You already know you can. You've been doing it. He paused. The question is whether you still want to. I looked at my screen. The file tree.
11 years of invisible architecture, displayed in folders and version histories and the accumulated timestamps of 10,000 hours.
And? I said. And that's a different question, he said. That one's not about the company.
He finished his coffee, stood up, and knocked once on the doorframe on his way out, a small, habitual gesture that meant good night in the particular language of people who have worked late together too many times to count. I sat there for a while longer after he left. I wasn't looking at the files anymore. I was thinking about the question. Not can I hold this? Not how do I fix this? The other one. The one I had never, in 11 years, allowed myself to ask, because asking it would have required me to admit that I had a preference, that there was a version of this in which I mattered not as infrastructure, but as a person, and that the version I had been living in was not that one. Why am I still obligated to hold something that no one has even bothered to see? I didn't have an answer. But it was the first time in 11 years I had let the question exist without immediately reaching for a solution, and in the specific silence of that office, with the city moving below the window, that felt like something. I wasn't sure yet what kind of something. I would find out, I supposed, in 3 weeks, when everyone gathered in a glass room on the 14th floor and waited for me to do what I had always done. I closed the laptop. I turned off the light. I took the coffee Hyunwoo had left and drank it cold in the elevator, and I went home. The restaurant Min Young had chosen was the kind of place that understood its own purpose. Not flashy, she had better taste than flashy, but precise, low lighting that made everyone look like a better version of themselves, a private room in the back with a long table set for 22, wine that had been selected 2 weeks in advance by someone whose job it was to make other people feel that the details had been handled. The kind of restaurant you book when you want a room full of people to feel, before anything is said, that they are already part of a success. 11 days before signing. This was the pre-celebration, not the celebration itself, which would come after, but the moment where everyone who had been told to believe gathered in one room and confirmed to each other that belief had been correct. The Hyawan board liaison was there, Kwon, with 2 of his associates. 3 investors from the early rounds who had held through the lean periods and were now being rewarded with a dinner at which their patience would be made to feel like wisdom. Sumin. 3 of the division heads. Legal counsel from both sides, not working tonight, just present, which was its own form of signal. And Taeyang, seated 4 places from Min Young, close enough to be part of the inner gravity of the table without being indiscreetly adjacent. He wore the same charcoal suit he'd worn to his first meeting, or one exactly like it, and he was already in conversation with Kwon's associate by the time I arrived, the way he always seemed to be already in conversation, already positioned, already part of whatever the center of the room was. I sat where I was placed. To Min Young's left, which was where I had always sat at events like this, and which felt, tonight, less like a position of closeness than like a position of proximity near the center, but not of it, the way a load-bearing column is near the room without being the room. The first hour was easy enough. This was a skill I had developed without naming it, the ability to be present at an event whose texture was uncomfortable in ways too subtle to name without sounding like I was making something of nothing. I drank the wine. I spoke with Kwon's associate about the technical handoff timeline, which she found reassuring in the way that people who don't fully understand technical handoffs find detailed explanations reassuring. I watched Min Young work the table the way she had always worked a room, with genuine warmth, a quality that was one of the things I had fallen in love with and had never stopped admiring, even now, even here, even with everything I was carrying, and I felt the particular ache of admiring something that has started to cost more than you expected. Speeches were made. Kwon said something about vision and execution, and looked at Min Young, and the room tilted its warmth toward her. One of the early investors, a small, compact man named Shin who had written the first check 8 years ago and never once, in 8 years, made it feel like leverage, stood briefly and said that the thing he had bet on was not a platform or a market or a valuation, but a person, and he still believed he had been right. He looked at Min Young. He nodded once in my direction, just once, the small nod of a man who understood more about how rooms worked than rooms usually gave him credit for, and sat down.
Min Young thanked everyone.
She was graceful. She was exactly as good at this as she had always been, maybe better, and I watched her from 4 places away and thought, she built herself this. She really did. Whatever I had built underneath it, the thing standing in the light was hers. I had never doubted that, and I didn't doubt it now. What I doubted was the version of the story that had no room in it for both things to be true at once. The table loosened after the main course. Small groups formed, the way they do when a dinner moves from official to social, and I found myself standing near the far end of the room with a glass of water, watching. Hyunwoo had not been invited, this was above his level in the event's hierarchy, which was a sentence that felt absurd given how many of the things being celebrated tonight he had contributed to, but I found myself wishing, briefly, that he were here. He would have stood next to me and said something dry and exactly accurate, and we would have laughed once, quietly, and that would have been enough. I was standing there when I heard it. I was not trying to overhear. I want to be precise about this, because the version in which I am a man cataloging grievances, collecting evidence, building a case, that is not what happened. What happened was that the door to the small corridor leading to the private bathrooms was half open, and Min Young and Tae Yang had stepped just inside it, and the acoustics of that particular corner of the room carried their voices to where I was standing with a clarity that had nothing to do with my intention. They were not whispering. That was the first thing I understood. They were speaking in the normal, comfortable volume of 2 people having a routine conversation in a semi-private space, the volume of people who are not saying anything they believe requires concealment. The board call is the main thing before the 14th, Taeyang said.
If Kwan's satisfied going in, the signing itself is a formality.
Kwan's satisfied.
Min Young's voice.
Easy, certain.
He was satisfied an hour ago. Did you see him with Jae-won during the handoff conversation? He loves the technical depth.
That's always been Jae-won's thing, he makes people feel like the foundation is solid.
Smart. Keep him doing that through the signing. A small pause.
When Min Young spoke again, her voice had the slightly lower, slightly more candid quality that came when she was thinking out loud rather than presenting. He's been quiet.
The last few weeks.
I think the equity thing landed harder than I expected.
How hard? Not hard enough to be a problem.
She said it without any particular coldness, which was, I understood, the most precise description of the problem.
He'll recalibrate. He always does.
The thing with Jae-won is that he processes privately, and then he comes back to the work because the work is where he makes sense of things.
I've watched him do it a dozen times. And after the signing? A brief pause.
I heard her shift, the soft sound of fabric, someone settling into a thought.
After the signing, the structure changes naturally.
He's more operations than strategy at the scale we're moving to. He knows that, even if he hasn't said it yet.
He doesn't love the public side. He never has.
So we let the integration period do some of that work on its own.
The new org design puts him where he's strongest. It's not a demotion, it's just a more accurate fit. And if he pushes back? He won't make it a public thing. That's not how he operates.
He'll want to talk it through, and we'll talk it through, and he'll see the logic. A small, almost fond exhale. He's frustrating sometimes, but he's not unreasonable. He understands that the company has to come first.
He's believed that longer than anyone.
I stood there. The corridor conversation continued for another few exchanges, something about the Hyewan board call, something about a press release that would be timed to the signing, but I had stopped processing the words in sequence. I was holding the ones I'd already heard, turning them over with the particular, lightless attention of someone who has just understood something they cannot ununderstand.
He'll recalibrate. He always does.
We let the integration period do some of that work.
He won't make it a public thing. That's not how he operates.
She was not plotting against me. I need to be clear about this, even now, even telling it from the inside, there was no malice in her voice, no satisfaction, no cruelty. What I heard was something harder to name and, in its own way, harder to absorb. I heard a woman who knew me, who genuinely, accurately knew me, describing my behavior in my limits and my capacity for adaptation with the calm, fond precision of someone describing a reliable piece of infrastructure. She was not dismissing me. She was depending on me. She was depending on the version of me that had shown up, recalibrated, processed privately, and returned to the work for 11 years, and she had built her plans for the future on the assumption that this version would continue to show up on schedule, the way it always had, because that was what it did. She was not wrong about who I had been. That was the specific, terrible thing. Every prediction she had made was accurate. Every version of myself she had described was one I recognized. What she had not accounted for, what she could not have accounted for, because I had given her no evidence to suggest otherwise, was that the person she was describing had spent a Friday night alone in a quiet office, counting load-bearing walls, and had come to the end of that exercise with a question he had never allowed himself to ask before. I set my glass down on a nearby table. Carefully, without sound. I straightened my jacket. I walked back toward the center of the room, and I took my seat, and when Min Young returned from the corridor a few minutes later and put her hand briefly on my shoulder in passing, warm, automatic, sure, I did not move away from it. Hyun-woo was not there. But I thought, briefly, of what he had said. The question is whether you still want to. I looked at the table, the people who had come because of what the company was, the documents that said what it would become, the man in the charcoal suit already part of the future that had been designed for him, and the woman who had built her confidence in all of it on the bedrock certainty that I would be standing exactly where she needed me to stand, on the day she needed me to stand there, because that was what I did. I sat at the table and I smiled when spoken to, and I answered questions about the technical timeline with the precise, reassuring depth that Kwan's associate had found so comforting earlier in the evening. And somewhere underneath all of it, very quietly, like a decision made in a room no one else had access to, something that had been in motion for a long time came to a stop. We got home at 11:15. Min Young took off her heels in the entryway the way she always did, one hand against the wall, the small exhale of someone releasing a held posture, and went directly to the kitchen for water. I hung my jacket. I heard the tap run, heard the particular sound of the refrigerator opening and closing, heard her moving through the apartment in the easy, unthinking way of someone at home in their own space. I went to the study. I told myself I wanted to check one thing, a vendor confirmation that had been pending since Thursday, a small item in the long list of small items that constituted the connective tissue of the closing process. I sat down at the desk and opened my laptop, and the confirmation was there, as expected, and I read it and filed it without thinking much about it. Then I sat for a moment in the quiet. The apartment had a particular sound at this hour. Not silence, the building was never fully silent, there was always something, traffic below or the elevator moving or the faint, structural settling that old buildings did, but a quality of stillness that existed only after 11, when the daytime noise had stopped and the nighttime noise hadn't fully started. I had spent many hours in this sound, in this room, working through problems that needed quiet to become solvable. Tonight I was not solving anything. Min Young appeared in the doorway around 11:40, changed into the gray sweater she wore at home, holding her water glass. She looked at me, at the laptop, at the set of my shoulders, at whatever my face was doing, with the particular attention of someone who has decided to pay attention. "You're still in work mode," she said. Not a criticism. An observation. Just finishing something. She came in and sat on the edge of the small couch against the far wall, the one that had always been nominally for guests and had instead become the place where she sat when she wanted to be near me while I worked without making a production of it. She tucked her feet under her. She was quiet for a moment. "Tonight was good," she said. I thought Kwan seemed genuinely comfortable. That's different from being polite, you can tell. He seemed comfortable, I agreed. 11 days. She said it with the soft, slightly disbelieving quality she gave to large numbers when they finally became real. I keep thinking I'll feel more ready. You'll feel it when you're in the room. She smiled, a small smile, directed at the middle distance rather than at me, the smile of someone turning a thought over. You're always right about that. A pause. Are you okay? I looked at the screen. Tired. I know. She watched me for a moment, and there was something in the watchfulness, something slightly more careful than her usual register, a quality of paying closer attention than the conversation seemed to require. She had noticed something. I understood this, and I understood that what she had noticed she was filing under a category she already had, J1 quiet, processing, will return to baseline. I recognized the category because I had spent 11 years confirming its accuracy. I've been thinking, she said, that after the signing, we should go somewhere. Just the two of us. Before the integration period really gets going. A week somewhere with no meetings. That sounds good, I said. It was the correct answer. It was also true, in some partial, complicated way. There was a version of after the signing in which that was exactly what we did, and I could see its shape clearly, and the shape was not entirely unpleasant. This was part of what made everything difficult to hold in a single thought. I was not leaving a bad marriage. I was not, even now, certain of what I was doing. What I was certain of was narrower and more specific. I was not going to walk into that conference room tomorrow and perform the version of myself that made the deal work, at the cost of confirming every assumption she had ever made about the ceiling of what I would accept. Whether that was the same as leaving, I had not yet decided. She went to bed around midnight, kissing me once, lightly, on the top of my head in passing, an old habit, the kind of unconscious tenderness that survives even the weather of a difficult period, the physical memory of a closeness that the mind hasn't fully accounted for yet. I sat in the study after she left and I did not open anything else on the laptop. I thought about the question of warning her. It had been, in some form, present since the dinner, the option of telling her directly, before the room was assembled and the investors were seated and the lawyers had opened their folders, that something had changed. That the calculus she had built her confidence on was not the calculus she thought it was. That the version of me who would absorb this particular sequence of events and then show up at the table and do his part and process it later, privately, and return to work, was a version of me that had existed yesterday and did not fully exist today. This was the honest thing to do. I did not pretend otherwise. But I sat with it, and I understood something. Telling her tonight, in the apartment, in the quiet, it would become a conversation. She would engage with it, genuinely, because that was also who she was. She would want to repair, would want to understand, would want to know what it would take. She would offer something. She would probably mean it. And the version of me who had sat in that office on Friday night, counting walls, asking the question he had never allowed before, that version understood that a conversation tonight, in this apartment, before the signing, was not really a conversation. It was another version of the same architecture. He explains what he needs. She adjusts, just enough, and the system continues. The building stays standing. The deal closes. And 6 months later, or a year later, the weight redistributes back to the same walls, because the walls have always held it, and no one has learned to imagine them gone. I owed her honesty. I did not believe I owed her the version of honesty that made everything easier for everyone except the question of whether anything would actually change. I went to bed at 1:30. I lay in the dark and listened to her breathe, the familiar rhythm of it, the specific sound of a person I had spent more than a decade sleeping beside. The room was the same room it had always been. The apartment was the same apartment. In 11 hours, the car would take us to the building on the 14th floor, and there would be lawyers, and documents, and people who had arrived expecting the day to end a certain way. I closed my eyes. I was not angry. I want to record that clearly, because it matters for what came next. I was not operating from anger, or from the desire to watch something burn, or from any version of vindication. What I was operating from was something quieter and harder to name, a kind of clarity that had arrived without drama, in a copy room and an empty office in the corridor of a restaurant, through the accumulated weight of things seen and heard and finally, irrevocably understood. I had spent 11 years being the person who stayed. Who returned. Who absorbed and recalibrated and fixed and held and stayed. Tomorrow I would find out, for the first time, who I was when I did into the conference room smelled like champagne nobody had drunk yet. I sat at the head of the long glass table, my name printed on a folder I hadn't opened, watching the room arrange itself around my wife like satellites finding their orbit. Minhyung sat at the center, in the chair that always seemed built for her, light from the floor-to-ceiling windows catching the edge of her smile. Beside her, close enough that it had stopped registering as strange to anyone but me, sat Tae-yang. 3 investors from the Hyawan Group were seated across from us, their lawyer beside them flipping through the final contract, 999 million, the number that had taken 10 years to become real. Our own legal team sat to my left. Sumin kept glancing at her tablet and then at me, the way she had been glancing at me for weeks, with the slightly unfocused attention of someone waiting for a variable to resolve. Everyone in that room believed they already knew how the day would end.
I had driven here alone.
Min Young had left 30 minutes earlier with Yuna, running through talking points in the car, and I had said I'd follow, and I had, and the drive had been quiet in a way that had nothing to do with traffic. The city moved past the windows. I watched it without thinking about it, the way you watch something when your attention is entirely elsewhere. I had not changed my mind in the night.
I want to record that.
There had been no last-minute reversal, no moment of clarity in the wrong direction, no version of her sleeping face that had undone the version of her voice I'd heard in the restaurant corridor. What the night had given me was simply the confirmation that what I had understood was what I understood, and that it would still be true this morning, and that was enough. The meeting began with the formal preamble, Kwan's lawyer reading through the structural summary, both legal teams confirming document versions, Suman walking through the financial closing conditions. Standard, careful, the procedural architecture of a large transaction, which I had built enough of over the years to be able to follow without paying much attention.
Min Young was excellent.
She had always been excellent at this, the calibrated authority of someone who believed completely in what she was saying, which was its own form of competence, separate from and additional to knowing the material. She walked through the integration timeline, addressed 2 questions from the Haiwan side about the transition period, said the right things about leadership continuity and platform stability.
Kwan nodded at intervals. His associates took notes. Taeyang spoke twice in the first 40 minutes.
Both times he said something accurate and well-framed, and both times Min Young's eyes moved to him with the small, approving attention of someone whose confidence in a choice has been confirmed. I watched this happen, twice, from my position at the table, and felt nothing I hadn't already felt before, which was almost a relief. Before we moved to execution, Kwan's lawyer said, setting down his pen and looking up, we need the confirming statement on the closing section. The technical handoff terms, the guarantee clauses, and the informal partnership understandings referenced in Exhibit C, Mr. Han.
That was me. Han Jae-won.
The room oriented toward me with the collective attention of people who have been waiting for a specific thing to happen. Min Young turned toward me with the easy, automatic expectation of someone reaching for a light switch they'd used 10,000 times.
Not looking, really. Just expecting. I looked at the folder. I looked at her.
I looked, briefly, at Taeyang, who was watching me with the particular composure of someone who was prepared for several versions of a moment and believes he can manage any of them.
I thought about 11 years.
Not in sequence, not as a list of sacrifices to be balanced against each other, but as a weight, the specific physical weight of a decade of decisions made in a particular direction, and what it felt like to put that weight down.
I stood up.
The room didn't react immediately, standing was not unusual, people stood to present, to gesture toward screens.
But I didn't move toward the screen.
I buttoned my jacket, the way I always did before leaving a room, and I looked at the lawyer, then at the Haiwan investors, and finally, only briefly, at my wife.
Then sign without me, I said. The first 3 seconds were almost silent. Min Young laughed. Not loudly, a small, warm exhale, the kind she produced when a situation had a simple explanation she hadn't gotten to yet. She reached over and touched my sleeve, lightly. J1, she said, low enough to be almost private, though the room was not private. Sit down. We're almost done. She wasn't afraid.
I had known she wouldn't be, and knowing hadn't made it easier to witness, but I had witnessed it anyway. She was not afraid, because in 10 years I had never once not come back to the table. She had built an entire understanding of this marriage, this company, this moment, on that single fact, and the fact had never failed her, and so there was no mechanism in her for the fear that it might.
I don't need a moment, I said. I've made my decision.
I picked up my folder unopened, the contract still sealed inside, and I walked toward the door.
Behind me, the room recalibrated.
I heard it without seeing it, the specific silence of people revising an assumption, the soft scrape of a chair, someone's intake of breath. Then Min Young's voice, still steady, still performing certainty for the room, he'll be back before we finish.
She said it warmly. Almost fondly.
As if this were a known quantity, as if I were whether she had learned to read, a pattern she could name and account for.
I closed the door behind me and stood in the corridor. I stood there for approximately 30 seconds.
Not because I was uncertain, I was not uncertain, but because I was waiting to feel something I had expected to feel, some version of the release or the loss or the enormity of the thing I had just done, and what I felt instead was a very particular quiet, the quiet of a mechanism that has been under tension for a long time and has finally, simply, been allowed to stop. I heard it begin through the door. Not shouting, there was no shouting, which was, somehow, worse. What I heard was the specific sound of a room in which a conversation has been interrupted by an inconvenient reality and is attempting to resume without the means to do so. Kwan's lawyer, careful and precise. For the record, the closing guarantees in Section 7 are tied to Mr. Han's personal authorization. If he is not executing, Suman, let me just give me a moment, Kwan's lawyer, continuing, the informal partnership agreements referenced in Exhibit C, the ones with the Busan Logistics Consortium and the 3 technical partners listed in Schedule 2, are those independent of Mr. Han's direct relationships, or applause. The kind of pause that answers a question before anyone speaks. Suman again, quieter, most of those were his direct relationships. Kwan himself, measured, unhurried, the tone of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and intends to understand what he's in. When you say his direct relationships, you mean they were developed and maintained by him personally, not by the company institutionally. Another pause. Longer. Min Young, they originated from his relationships, yes. But they're company relationships now. There's no reason they wouldn't transfer. The Haiwan investor across from Kwan, a woman named Cho who had said very little in the previous hour, Ms. Han. The authentication structure for the enterprise integration tier, the handoff clause says confirmation requires authorization from the technical architect of record. Who is that? Silence. Not long. Just long enough. Sumin, almost inaudible, that's J1. Cho, and the guarantee structure on the Series C rollover terms, the personal guarantee clause in the closing package. Is that legal counsel from the Haiwan side, now, reading from the document, guaranteed by Han Jae-won in his personal capacity, independent of company assets, contingent on his continued participation in the closing process. He looked up. That language is quite specific. The sound the room made then was not a sound, exactly. It was the absence of the sound a room makes when people believe they are about to do something, replaced by the absence of that belief. I had heard rooms change acoustics before. I had never heard one change quite like this. Kwan, slowly, I want to understand the situation clearly, before we proceed in any direction. The technical execution depends on his authorization. The personal guarantees are his. The primary investor relationships on your side were built through him. Is there any element of the closing structure that doesn't? He stopped. Start it again. What, precisely, does this transaction look like without him in the room? The question hung there. I could not see faces, but I had spent 11 years reading rooms, and I did not need to. Min Young, this is a temporary show, not unkindly but without softness, Ms. Han. We need an accurate answer, not a reassurance. I did not go back in. I had considered it, had stood in the corridor and considered, in the specific and honest way of someone who has made a decision and is checking it against its consequences, whether there was anything being said in that room that required me to return. Whether there were people in there who would be harmed by my absence in ways that I owed them protection from. I thought about Sumin, who had been navigating this situation with a kind of careful loyalty that did not deserve to be punished. I thought about Shin, the early investor, who had written the first check 8 years ago and had made it feel like belief rather than leverage. I thought about the company, not Min Young's company, not Taeyang's company, but the company as a thing in itself, built from 10 years of accumulated decisions, the thing Hyunwoo worked in and the operations team ran and 40-something people had organized their professional lives around. I stood in the corridor and I held all of it, and I did not go back in. Not because I didn't care about any of it, but because I understood, with the clarity that had been building for months and had arrived, fully formed, on a Friday night in a quiet office, that going back in was not actually a choice between doing harm and preventing it. Going back in was a choice between 2 versions of harm. One was visible, immediate, landing today in a glass room on the 14th floor, on people who had built their expectations around a certainty that was not as certain as they thought. The other was invisible, distributed across time, landing on me and continuing to land, in 100 versions of this moment, as long as I continued to make the harm invisible by absorbing it alone. I had been very good, for a very long time, at making harm invisible by absorbing it. I was standing in the corridor, learning what happened when I stopped. The door opened at 11:48.
It was Sumin.
She looked at me for a moment, at the folder still in my hand, at whatever my face was, and she did not ask me to come back, which told me what she had understood about what was happening in there.
What she said was, "Is there anything you want me to tell them?"
I thought about it. I thought about all the things that were true, and how many of them were already visible through the glass walls of the conference room without my saying a word.
"Tell them," I said, "that the guarantee clauses will need to be renegotiated. Tell them the timeline should probably move." She nodded once. She started to turn back. "Sumin." She stopped. "The Busan logistics window opens in 9 days. Make sure someone knows about it. I'll send you the file."
She looked at me for a moment with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone who has been watching something develop for a long time and is looking at its arrival.
Not surprised. Just present.
"Okay," she said.
She went back inside.
I heard the door close, the room reconvening, voices beginning again in the careful, effortful register of people attempting to manage something they had not known they would need to manage.
I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button. I stood there while it came.
Behind me, down the corridor, through the closed door, the building that I had built was learning what it was made of.
I had already known. That was the difference. The elevator doors opened.
I stepped inside, and they closed behind me, and for the first time in 11 years, I did not reach back to hold them open. I am telling this part from what I was told afterward, and from what I saw myself in the days that followed, because I was not in the room when most of it happened.
I want to be accurate about that.
I did not watch it unfold in real time, did not stand somewhere and observe the consequences arriving. What I have is Sumin's account, given to me 10 days later over coffee in a place that was not the office, and Hyunwoo's, given in pieces over the following weeks, and the version I assembled from those two accounts and from the documents I eventually reviewed, and from the single conversation I had with Min Young before the lawyers became the primary form of communication between us. What I know is that the room did not recover after I left.
Kwan had asked for a recess at 12:03.
30 minutes, ostensibly to allow the Hyawan team to confer internally, which was the polite way of saying that they needed to establish, privately, what they had actually signed up for and whether the answer was still acceptable. The Hyawan lawyer spent most of that 30 minutes on a call with their institutional risk office in Seoul. The associate named Cho spent it reading the closing documents with the specific attention of someone looking for the thing they should have found earlier. What she found, Sumin told me, was not one thing. It was the accumulated texture of a structure that had been built for a specific kind of use, by a specific person, in ways that were completely sound but were not designed with his absence in mind because his absence had not been a design parameter.
The personal guarantee clauses were the largest visible item.
But underneath those were smaller things, authorization chains that named him specifically rather than his role, vendor relationships logged under his direct contact information, informal understandings with 3 partners that existed in email threads and phone histories rather than in formal agreements, because he had been the kind of person who could maintain an informal understanding through consistent behavior over years, which was a form of institutional reliability that did not transfer. By org chart revision.
To be continued.